All right, the last time we were together, we were talking about MRP and what it is, right? Marginal revenue product, which is the extra revenue you get when you hire another unit of labor. That's what it is, the extra revenue you get from hiring another unit of labor. So think about what that really means. What it means, again, is that the marginal revenue product is the marginal benefit of hiring another worker, okay? And if you remember way back in Unit 1 and Unit 2 of this class, we talked about the fact that marginal benefit represents demand, right? So if MRP is the marginal benefit of hiring a worker, then really what it is it's the demand for workers. So MRP is the demand curve for workers, for labor. Okay, that's what it is. MRP equals demand. Okay, so that's our demand curve for factors of production is MRP. Right. Well, let's flip it. Let's talk about marginal cost and supply curves for resources, for labor in this case. Okay. So we look at this value it's called either one of these: marginal resource cost or marginal factor cost, MRC or MFC. You can call it either one. Call it either one. Don't let it confuse you. Right. They're the same topic: marginal factor cost or the marginal resource cost. Right. So what is that? Well, remember. Marginal is your extra, right? Your change in your total. So MRC or MFC is your change in your total cost when you hire one more worker. So my marginal resource cost is the extra cost of hiring a worker. Okay. MRP is the extra benefit I get from hiring a worker, the extra revenue, right? MRC or MFC, okay, is the extra cost of hiring a worker. Okay. What's the formula for it? It's a marginal value, so it's always change in over change in. So in this case, it's our change in our total cost when we hire another resource. So it'd be our change in total cost divided by change in the quantity of the resource. If we're talking about labor, it'd be change in total cost over change in quantity of labor, right? That's what our MRC for labor would be, or MFC. Okay. Now, our MRC or MFC, okay, that's our marginal cost for hiring a worker. Okay. All right. And so think about this. You have your profit maximizing rule of life that we've learned all the way back in Unit 1, right? If we're trying to profit maximize, we always do something until marginal cost equals marginal benefit. So therefore, if the marginal revenue product is our marginal benefit and the marginal resource or marginal factor cost is our marginal cost, then what are you going to do? Well, if your goal is to maximize total profits, the profit maximizing quantity of a resource, in this case labor, the profit maximizing quantity of labor would be where MRP equals MRC. And that will be the key rule that you need to know for this unit. MRP equals MRC. That's the profit maximizing quantity of a resource, is when you get to that relationship. Okay? So think about this now. Let's say that I hire or buy the profit maximizing quantity of factors of production, the profit maximizing quantity of resources. Well, if I'm buying or hiring the profit maximizing quantity of resources, that should produce the profit maximizing quantity of output, right? Where does that happen? Well, that happens where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So think about this, right? A profit maximizing firm always produces where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, MC equals MR. Okay? They're going to hire the number of resources that gives them that output. Okay, if they're hiring the profit maximizing number of resources. So if profit maximizing number of resources is where MRP equals MRC, the output that will be produced from those resources will be the output that you would get where MC equals MR. Okay. Now I want to talk about some different types of market structures in the factor market. Now in a product market, we talked about 4 different types, right? Perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopolies, and monopolies. In the factor market, we're only going to talk about 2. We're going to talk about perfectly competitive factor markets, and we're going to talk about what are called monopsonies, which we'll get to later. Okay, so let's think about what a perfectly competitive factor market would be, and I'm going to use what you already know for perfectly competitive output market. So we've already learned what a perfectly competitive output market is, right? It's got many buyers and sellers, identical products, right, from free entry and exit. Those are your 3 primary characteristics of a perfectly competitive output market. Okay? Well, characteristics for a perfectly competitive factor market are going to be very similar. It's easy to enter and leave, many buyers and sellers, and instead of identical products, it'll be identical resources. Okay? So what I'm saying is like if I hired a labor in a perfectly competitive factor market, a perfectly competitive labor market, then what that would mean is that there's no difference in the units of labor that I hire. I could hire John to work for me, or I could hire Mark to work for me. Both of them will have the exact same skills. So it doesn't matter if I hire John or if I hire Mark. They're both going to produce. They're both capable of producing the same amount, right? They have both at the same skill level. Okay, so they're identical in that way. All right. So how does this look on a graph? All right. Well, let's talk about how this looks on a graph. And then I'm going to start with what you know. So if you're on the top in green, we're going to draw a perfectly competitive product market. So this is what we've been doing for a while now in this class, right? So the market is going to be supply and demand, and where the two curves intersect, that's going to be our price of this good, and this is going to be the quantity of the good. So this would be our market price, and this would be our market quantity. Okay, and then we'll use that market price, the firm will, right, to determine its price. And it's a perfectly competitive product market, right? So everything they sell, they're going to sell at the same price. So that means that the marginal revenue, demand, average revenue, and price will all equal each other. Okay, that Mr. Darp line that we talked about. Okay, and then when you add in marginal cost, where MR equals MC, this will be the output that this firm produces. So this is the firm's output, QF. This is the firm's price, PF, and it's market price and market quantity. Remember that the market price and the firm's price are the exact same value, right? Because the firm is a price taker. Well, in a perfectly competitive factor market, okay, we're gonna have very similar outcomes, except now we're looking at resources instead of goods, instead of products. Okay, we're looking at factors. Okay, so the market's going to be regular supply and demand. All right, except that now notice what I have here. Instead of quantity, this is quantity of labor. And instead of price, this is wage. All right, so where these two curves intersect, this would be the equilibrium wage for the market. And this would be the equilibrium quantity of labor in this market. Okay, and because this firm is a perfectly competitive, it's hiring in a perfectly competitive factor market, okay, they're going to pay the wage that the market gives them. Again, they're going to be they're going to be like up here, they'd be price takers. Down here, they're going to be wage takers, right? So they have to hire at the market wage. So what's the market wage? It's right here. So we're going to use these little dotted lines again to connect it. Okay, and this is going to be the wage for the company. So in other words, every unit of labor that this firm hires, they're going to hire at that wage. Okay. Now I established before, right, that MRP is the demand curve. Okay. Now marginal product, because of diminishing marginal product will always decrease. MRP, if we think about it in a really simple way, right, MRP equals marginal product times the price of the good. Okay. This value right here is always going to eventually decrease, right, because of diminishing marginal product. This value, if we're in a perfectly competitive product market, they're never going to change this value. So if this value is getting smaller and it's multiplied by a constant value, that means that this value is going to get smaller as as we get more and more labor. Okay, so in other words, what we get is we get a downward sloping demand curve. So this would be our demand for labor, and it's our MRP of labor. Okay. Now, what else is this? Okay. Now, this is the wage that the workers are willing to work at, right? So it's the wage they're willing to supply their labor at. Okay. But it's also one more thing. Okay. Remember what marginal resource cost is, or marginal factor cost. It's the extra cost to hire one more worker. Okay. So imagine that this equilibrium wage right here is, say, $10 an hour, right? It's $10. If I hire a worker, that worker is going to increase my cost by $10. If I hire a second worker, that worker is still going to get paid a wage of $10, so they're going to increase my cost by $10 more. If I hire a third worker, that worker is going to increase my cost by $10 more. So every time I hire a worker, since I'm paying them all the same wage, my marginal cost of hiring the worker stays the same. So think about what that means then. It means that this is the wage, the supply, and it's also our MRC or our MFC. That's our marginal resource cost. Okay? And so what's the rule? They always hire until MRP equals MRC, right? So that's where the two curves intersect. So this would be the quantity of labor that the firm would hire. Okay? So here's what I want you to think about, right? Look up here, okay? Remember in the last video I told you guys that, like, if you think about like the circular flow diagram, we're on the opposite side of that circular flow diagram now. So the buyers and sellers are like different in the product market. The businesses were the sellers and the individuals were the buyers. In the factor market, the individuals are the sellers and the businesses are the buyers. So we get like everything's like flipped. And if you look at it, that's exactly what's going on here in these two graphs, right? Like everything is flipped, right? You have an upward sloping marginal cost curve and then a flat demand curve. Now you have a flat marginal cost curve and a downward sloping demand curve. So everything is like mirror image of itself, okay? Now, if these two sets of graphs were representing the same company, so this is a firm selling in a perfectly competitive product market and hiring workers in a perfectly competitive factor market. Again, what I was saying before, right? This quantity of labor right here, if this is the same firm right here, this quantity of labor should be producing this quantity of output, because this is the profit maximizing quantity of output. This is the profit maximizing quantity of resources. The profit maximizing quantity of resources will produce the profit maximizing quantity of the good. Okay? All right. Now, a couple of other things I want to talk about to kind of wrap all this up. This is what I just showed you. Okay, so I showed you the MRP and the demand in MFC or MRC. Okay. Last thing I want to discuss is these two relationships. All right. Now, typically in the real world, you don't just buy one resource. Okay. You buy multiple resources. You buy a little bit of land, a little bit of capital, some ideas, some labor. Right? You buy combinations of resources. Okay, so typically you don't just hire one or buy one resource, you buy combinations. So here's how we look at this, okay? If I want to buy the profit maximizing combination of capital and labor, this looks like a different formula than what I just showed you, but it's actually the exact same formula, okay? In other words, MRP of labor divided by the price of labor, aka the MRC, right? That should equal 1. And if these two things, if that divided by that equals 1, then that means that these two things are the same. In other words, MRP equals MRC. Same thing goes for capital. The MRP of capital should equal the price, or divided by the price of capital should equal 1. So again, that means that they equal each other. So the MRP of capital should equal the MRC of capital. Okay, so that's profit maximizing combination. And we're going to do some practice with this in a couple of days. Okay. The other thing we could have, though, is what's called least cost. Okay, what is least cost? Well, suppose that the profit maximizing combination of resources produces 100 goods, but I get a customer who only comes to me and asks me for like 50 goods. Well, the problem is I can't make 100 goods because I only have an order for 50, right? So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to produce those 50 units, and that's it. And I'm going to produce them at the least possible cost to my business, and that's the way that I can do like the best profit for 50 goods. So what do I do if I'm going to do that? Okay, I'm going to use this formula down here. I'm going to say the marginal product of labor divided by the price of labor should equal the marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital. And here's the key part. These should equal each other for the last unit of labor that I buy and the last unit of capital I buy. So in other words, if I hire 4 workers and buy 5 machines, the 4th worker's marginal product per dollar spent on that worker, that's the price of labor, right? So this is marginal product per dollar spent. The 4th worker's marginal product per dollar spent should equal the 5th machine's marginal product per dollar spent. And why is this? Okay, the reason why is because think about what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to produce the good at the lowest possible cost. So if I'm trying to produce the good at the lowest possible cost, I'm going to buy the resource that will give me the most output at the lowest possible cost, right? In other words, the best marginal product per dollar spent. Marginal product of labor divided by the price of labor, or the best marginal product per dollar spent. Marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital. And again, we'll do practice on this as well in a couple of days.